Okay, thanks everyone for joining. This is our last session of the day in the DB2 stream for 2025's GSUK's virtual conference. So thank you everyone for joining. It's my pleasure to introduce Ron Coleman and Anthony Anter from BMC Software, uh, who are going to tell us about bringing your data to DevOps. So if anybody has any questions, please pop them into the chat and we'll have a look at them as we go ahead. But in the meantime, over to you, gentlemen.
Thank you very much, Marcus. Really appreciate that. Really appreciate the time from GS UK. And so bring your data to DevOps, right? I'm Anthony Anter. I'm a DevOps architect and evangelist here for BMC Software, and I'm with Ron Coleman. I'll let you introduce yourself, Ron.
Thanks, Anthony. Yes, my name is Ron Coleman, and I am the Director of Product Management for the BMC Data Solution. So that's AMI Data for DB2 and AMI Data for IMS. Happy to be here with you guys and hopefully give you some good information.
Yeah, so I put this together with Ron because I think that there are a lot of organizations, and I'm hoping most of the people on this session are already a certain ways down the DevOps path, right? You've already started your DevOps journey, and you're starting to put automation and pipelines and DevOps capabilities in place in your organization. Now, wherever you're at on that journey, that's not what this is about. That's a separate session that will come later. Where you're at on your journey doesn't matter. But I think a lot of times we only singularly think about DevOps in the case of application development, right? But I want to ask you a question, right? What makes up an application? What does an application consist of? When you think about it, when you think about your application, right? Typically you think about infrastructure, right? Your application consists of a certain amount of infrastructure, a certain topology that you use to deploy your application out to, right? Your application also consists of operating systems and utilities, right? Like, where am I going to deploy my application to? Am I deploying it to the cloud? Am I deploying it to a mainframe LPAR? Am I deploying it into a traditional VM? Am I deploying a mobile app? Whatever that may be, that operating system and all those utilities built around it, that's also really part of your application. Workflows, right? Your organizational workflows, your automation, your capabilities that basically automate your batch jobs, automate, what the things that your application does. That's also part of your application. And more you're seeing things like infrastructure as code and everything as code as patterns that help you keep your application in a single place and deploy it in a single capability, right? Automation. If you're going down the DevOps journey, you know that the automation and the pipelines and all those capabilities that you use to manage this are just as much a part of your application as your source code. Now, I want you to notice something else too as I go down this list. So far, I haven't said source code, right? I think it's a given that your application is source code. And I think it's a given that that most people think of an application as source code. But the point I'm making here is that it's not just source code. Your application from an app dev point of view is not just source code, right? And here we go, source code, right? Of course, your application is the source that runs the business logic for what you're trying to accomplish. Metadata. What is all of that metadata that surrounds your application? Now, here's the reason I'm in this track, and here's the reason that Ron and I are talking about this. Your data schema. What databases? What is the schema of your data? What are the tables and resources that you have in your data that make up your application? That is as important to your application and what makes up your application as the source code, as the infrastructure, as anything else. If you are an application without any data and without a good schema, then you really are fighting with one hand, right? Fighting with one arm tied behind your back. And the same thing is true with your data. I've heard arguments a lot from DBAs, which coming from the app dev side, I'll say there's always the DBA and the app dev and the app dev and the DBA. But I've heard a lot of arguments that your application is primarily data. The whole point of your application is to manipulate data, to take in data, to modify data, to collect data, to store data, to read data, to understand that data, to make adjustments to that data. The data and the data schema is as much a part of your application as any of the other parts, including the source code. And I think that gets lost when we talk about modern DevOps and modern DevOps practices. Right now, you have pipelines. You have probably automated build capabilities, automated deployment capabilities, automated scanning and testing capabilities in some cases. But you're only looking at it from a source code and an infrastructure point of view. And rarely do I see, especially on the mainframe, people think about their data and their data schema as part of their application framework. And I think that's where we're going to come in today and we're going to talk about this. So let's think about current application development, right? So like I said, you have a pipeline, right? Your engineers are writing and developing code, and they probably have some kind of CI process locally where they're doing a build and running some tests, or at least doing a compile. And that's going back and forth, right? That's a continuous circle until they're ready with their change. Then they check their change in and they're doing a build, right? You have a pipeline that basically takes that change, hopefully, and starts pushing it down a workflow or a pipeline to build it, to scan it, to deploy it, and to test it. And for your source code and for your source and making business logic changes, that works great, right? That's a pretty standard pattern. And we have that done. But let me throw a wrinkle in. Let's say as part of that change, you have to include some SQL changes, right? Let's say as part of that change, you have to include those SQL changes. And how many of your applications have tons of SQL, whether it's COBOL DB2 or stored procedures or just general SQL that needs to interact with your database, right? I know when I was doing app dev that was a part of probably 80% of the changes that got pushed down the pipe, right? So if I have a SQL change, that's not built into this pipeline. Typically, those SQL changes, I have to have them manually reviewed by your DBAs in order for them to be reviewed and part of the deployment, right? So now I have an offline process that is involving another team, someone else. Now that DBA has to go in and basically review your SQL change to make sure you're not doing something like a select star from XYZ table, with 28 million rows pulled into memory, et cetera, et cetera. I can also tell you from my time that probably 60-70% of the issues, the production issues that we had, were runaway SQL, were bad SQL that was bogging the system down that had to then be adjusted, right? And this process is still manual, but it is also assuming that the SQL changes are reviewed ahead of the deployment. If they are not, then these SQL changes are an offline process. So now I have an automated process to get me most of the way into production. But now probably the most important pieces of what I'm changing are being reviewed offline, right? Now let's add in a schema change. Well, let's add in a schema change, right? That is an even more onerous process I have to change my schema. I have to add a column to a table. I have to add a table into my general DB schema, whatever that may be, right? Again, that has to go through a separate process with a DBA. And that has to now be manually updated by the DBA and has to be coordinated with the push of your source code, right? So now for one change, I possibly have 3 different workflows going on, 2 of them manual, in order to make that change. And what I'm here to tell you is there is a better way. There is a better way to do this, and there is a better way to handle this. There's no reason to have 3 engagements tying up 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 to who knows how many DBAs and other people in order to push this single change down, right? There is a better way. So let's start back at the beginning. You have a pipeline, right? You have an automated pipeline that handles pushing your application down your path to production. But like I said before, what is an application? An application is more than just the source, right? So as part of that pipeline, you have to have a modern IDE, right? You have that modern IDE that you're working in. But when it comes time to do your SQL, instead of having a manual process where a DBA has to go and review, automate your SQL with scanning. Whether you're using SonarQube or whether you're using DB2 for DevOps or Liquid Base or whatever tool you happen to do, you can automate that scanning. Make that SQL change a part of your DevOps process. Make it a part of your pipeline. So now that scan goes and you have a quality gate sitting there ready to stop anything to go through. And again, this is not to take the DBA out of the middle of your process. This is not to take the DBA away from being able to scan changes. This is to free up your DBA from having to do the day-to-day grunt work operations of reviewing every strip of SQL that goes down the path, and basically now frees up your high-priced and your very expert DBAs to do the work that they need to do to make your system run efficiently, to keep your data in check, and only kicks it out if there's an issue. It's making the system work for you. Don't do the heavy lifting. Make the system work for you, right? As part of that, you have code coverage metrics that make sure that everything that you're testing and everything that you're reviewing is a part of that change, that you're hitting the right thing. So now I know as a DBA or as a DevOps operator, I know that the stuff that I'm testing and the stuff that I'm scanning is the correct stuff, right? The same thing is true with your schema updates. That scan will also include your schema updates. And now I can automate those schema updates with the same set of tools that I was just talking about, right? I can now automate those schema updates and again, free that up from having the DBA to do every little thing that needs to be done and really only call out the DBA in exception cases where it is necessary for them to do it. The technology is there to build these data changes into your DevOps pipeline. So now you can bring the automation that the app dev guys have been enjoying for years into your data space, into your DBA space. And like I said, this is to free up the DBA. This is not to work around the DBA or push things through. This is to give the DBA the same tools that your DevOps engineers are using, that your SRE operations guys are using. Now the DBAs can start actually automating and have the system work for them instead of working for the system, right? And again, of course, all of this is predicated upon automated test data and testing. This is what makes all of this work. You make your schema changes in the lower levels, you automate this whole process, and then you make sure that your system is up and running with a really good set of regression and smoke tests with the proper test data. All of this can be built into a single pipeline. There's no offline, there is no offline separate pipeline, offline engagements, etc. And the system will automatically kick things out that require review from a person. So right now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn this over to Ron. Well, actually, let me do one more thing, right? I've been talking through what I've been saying, but this bullet list sort of alliterates the steps in all of this. And again, we've uploaded this deck onto the GS website, so it should be available for download at the end of this session for review. But what I'm going to do now is, instead of talking about the logical part of this, I'm going to turn this over to Ron, and Ron is going to walk you through what this looks like in reality. So Ron, go ahead and take it away.
Great. Thanks, Tony. Appreciate it. So yeah, as Tony said, what I want to do is I want to really bring this to life. And it's kind of a walkthrough demonstration to show the capabilities that Tony talked about, show you how they might come to life within different solutions, different tools out there. I'm going to use Jenkins as my pipeline tool, but it could be Azure, it could be Git, doesn't really matter what it is. And essentially what I'm going to do is I'm going to take what is already being done by your DBAs. Your DBAs are already reviewing the schema changes. They're already running tools to check the SQL. They're already doing all this work to make sure what's being deployed in production is actually good code, is good schema, validates site standards, and is acceptable. But what we're going to do differently is we're going to automate that process. So not doing anything special here. We're just automating what's already happening by the DBA. The other interesting thing is the number one reason I hear, and I'm sure Tony hears this as well, why can't we do that? Well, we can't do that. We need to control the process. So that's the number one reason, is to control the process. Well, we're not going to let you lose control of the process. We're going to basically create gates. And so you can control an approval process. This has to be reviewed first. We can't move forward till I accept, or this isn't really a problem, so I'm going to allow it to go through with no issues.
I hear that all the time, Ron. I hear that all the time. And what I find and what we recommend is that you start out with all those gates and you start out with all those manual approval process. But what you'll find over time is that eventually you get to the point where you're just pushing a button. You know what, you've reviewed, the system's already told you everything is thumbs up and you're good, and you're just pushing a button. So slowly you start taking those away until you just keep those essential pieces that you need to make sure that you have your, separation of duties and stuff like that. But I hear that all the time from both the DBA side and the app dev side.
Exactly. That's exactly right. So what you're seeing here on the screen is your standard pipeline. And this is what Tony talked about, where you're really only looking at code coverage, right? And you're not, doing a lot of different things out there. It's just a standard pipeline. But there are some things that we want to add to this pipeline. So let's start with the next slide. This really gets down into, really what I want to show you. So what like I mentioned here, I'm going to look at a Jenkins pipeline. And what you're seeing here highlighted in red are two new things that we're going to add, two new automation activities that we want to add out there. You see schema standards analysis, and you also see SQL assurance analysis. So what we want to do is automate that process of any sort of schema changes or any sort of schema adjustments that are happening as part of the pipeline. Likewise, we want to have that code test out there. So let's go ahead and test that SQL. Again, there's many different tools that you can use to do that. All we're doing is embedding those tools. We're automating the activity that those tools provide. And so these are the two things that we want to add to our existing pipeline that go along with the deployment of the code, the infrastructure, whatever else needs to be. And so what you're going to see here by the end of this is one single pipeline that'll basically handle everything from your code to your schema changes to your SQL changes, everything all in one place. Go ahead and move to the next slide, please, Tony. All right, so one of the key things underneath the covers to make this happen is to leverage something like a rules engine for your schema standards. And what I'm showing you here is just an example of different rules that you might have. Very simply, you know, you see a rule out here, it might be kind of small there, but DB name. You may have some naming conventions for the database that must be followed. You may have some table space naming conventions that must be followed. So it might be very simple things by, you know, like naming conventions that you have as standards in your environment. But then you might have things that are more complex, like, you know, additional table space might need to be universal table space, or, you know, other more complex items that any time a change in the schema goes into place, it must follow these standards. And a lot of times we refer to these as site standards, because these aren't standards that, you know, someone can set up for you automatically. These are standards that you have set up individually for your company, for your site, based off your, you know, how you want your DBAs to be managed, how you want different things to be named. And so having a rules engine is absolutely key to making this happen. And you know, a real sophisticated rules engine is more than just a, you know, if then. I mean, there's different when clauses that you might add. So, you know what, I only want to check the DB name if it's more than 3 characters. If it's under 3 characters, you can name it whatever you want. If it's more than 3 characters, I want to follow this particular standards. So you can actually do fairly complex activities, but this is a rules engine that your pipeline can automate. Again, everybody has something like this in place. It may be, you know, manually the DBA looks at it and looks through the schema changes and sees it, you know, makes sure that it follows their site standards, or there may be an automated tool, and maybe there's some scripts that they run. Everybody's doing this. But again, what we want to do is we want to automate that process and really get the DBA out of the way. They don't need to do this basic work. This is stuff that definitely is high priority for automation. And again, we can gate it. So maybe initially as you do this, you say, you know, every time it runs the schema standards and checks, I want to say a report of that. And then after I see that report, I can click next and say, go ahead. So embedding this rules engine into your CI/CD pipeline is really a key piece of the process here. Next slide, please, Tony. Okay, and so this is, you know, very simply, once you have that rules engine, essentially when you build your pipeline, you need to call that rules engine. And so this isn't, you know, any specific type of engine underneath there, or specific type of configuration, just an example of what you might have to do to build out that pipeline. You might have to, you know, give it the rules engine's name, provide some login activities. This is all standard stuff. It's part of the Jenkins engine here that you can embed. Again, doesn't matter what rules engine you use, you just embed it into your pipeline. All right, jump to the next one. And so once you've got that pipeline built out, there's some basic steps that are going to happen, some basic activities. One of the things that's going to happen is you're going to need your engine to basically generate a script of the changes that are being built. So if you have no changes out there, basically there's no reason to go through the rules engine pipeline. Very simple. Let's just cut it off and move forward. So again, automating that process instead of, you know, sending it to the DBA, 2 days later they look at it and say, well, there's no schema changes, it's approved, right? That can be just happen so quickly and so immediately that you don't even need to think about it. Now, once you have that script, that new schema can be validated against the supplied standards. So all those rules engines that I went through, all those standards, let's go ahead and compare those to the site standards, compare those to the script that's going to happen, and make sure that everything's being followed. Again, we can gate this again. All right, so I talked about the gating here, but approval requests can be sent to the DBA. basically saying, hey, here's what's changing out there. Do you accept this or do you not accept it? That's where people start, right? So everybody's a little concerned with automation, but this is fairly simple automation. We're not talking about a lot of complexity back behind the covers here. This is basically standard stuff. So it's easy to kind of start slow and do the approval, but this is something that you can quickly get past. And then finally, the other thing is, as these changes are being implemented, if something happens, we also want to build a rollback job, right? So we want to be able to get that schema back to its initial changes. If there's something that we don't agree with, some rule that isn't passed, we want to bring that back.
And that's always a manual process, right? That's always, I mean, in my experience, and you tell me if I'm wrong, that is always a big deal, and that is always a manual process. Whereas now, again, we're basically automating that functionality. So that way, number one, it's quicker, because if you do have to do that rollback, it's probably a serious situation if you've messed this up. And number two, again, it's making the system do the work for you.
Exactly. And that is, you're spot on. That is something that you absolutely want to automate. If you don't automate things like this and you do these manual processes, these are examples where mistakes are being made. All right. So they didn't follow the right standards. They didn't do this right. They didn't back the stuff out, after something failed. They didn't back it out correctly. And now you've got schema that's half there and half out there. Absolutely what you want to be able to automate, without a doubt. Now, the last thing here, the last one down there, if the other thing we want to do is not only look at the schema changes, but the SQL. All right. So don't forget about the SQL. Tony gave the example of someone going out there and put select star dot, everything on this table with 28 million rows, and boom, it just craters performance. So building in that solution, whatever you're using to do your SQL test, is an absolutely imperative part of adding it to the pipeline and automating that process. Okay, so here's an example as we just walk through this. So let's walk through this pipeline changes out there. So again, I'm using Jenkins. It doesn't have to be Jenkins. If you're Azure, if you're Git, whatever you want to use it, it's basically the same thing where you're just automating something. And so that first step, that first piece of the puzzle I talked about, and it's kind of small here in the Jenkins. I probably should have blown this up now that I'm looking at it on the screen here, but it's just reaching that point as are schema changes even required? And again, I mentioned early on, if schema changes aren't required, well, that's a real easy process to gain approval. It shouldn't even need approval. It just moves to the next step. But if this is a manual process, again, it's going to go to the DBA. It's going to have that time frame of the DBA looking at it, and the DBA going, oh, there's no changes required. We'll go ahead, of course. Let's automate that. We can get through that real quick. But if there are changes required, go ahead and go to the next one. This is where we start doing some other tests out there. Do those schema changes meet the site standards? Again, going back to that rules engine that's so important out there. What we're going to do is automatically check the schema that's being changed against any site standards that we have out there. Naming conventions, universal table spaces, whatever those things that we have defined, let's check against those standards. And if anything doesn't meet those standards, let's flag it. Now, again, this can be gated because there are certain times where, maybe the DBA would allow a certain standard to, not be worried about. What you want to do is build that into the process. So not only can, I approve something, but I can bypass and say, okay, allow this standard to be ignored in this particular case, and we don't even need an approval. All right. So again, this is using that against your rules engine. And this is where there's so many times that site standards fall apart because it's visually being looked at. It's not being automated. This eliminates that human error. Now, in this example here, what we've done is we've evaluated the site standards and it came back and they were not met. All right. And we spent a lot of time talking about backing out the changes. So we want to make sure that we are able to back out any changes in an automated fashion. Again, this is something that, typically is a manual process, and that manual process causes a lot of problems because if something is not backed out correctly, then you're out of sorts. Your schema does not match what it started with. It's partly there, it's partly not there. Let's automate that back out. Let's automate any changes that need to be pulled out.
You said that a couple times now too, Ron, and I think that's a very key point. Manual processes introduce human error. And it happens to all of us. No matter how good you are, no matter how smart you are, no matter how thorough you are, there is that possibility. The aperture is still open on there being human error. Whereas the system will always execute all the rules every time, no matter what, and give you a thumbs up, thumbs down, a green, a yellow, a red, whatever, however you implement that. And that is a really key point to keep in mind. Again, let the system do the work for you. Let the system do the work for you. So that way, if you're a little tired that day and you glance through something, and we've all done it. I've done it. I'm sure maybe Ron hasn't done it. Ron might be the only one who's never done that, but I at least have done that. And the simple fact of the matter is, again, getting rid of that manual, the manual errors that can be introduced is a big thing. How many times did you have to get up in the middle of the night on a bridge call because something slipped through? It's not anybody's fault. This isn't to call anybody out, but something slipped through. So now you're sitting there at 3 a.m. on a bridge call on Christmas Eve, with your kids hoping they get presents and you're wondering if they will. That's being dramatic, but you get my point. Just because let the system do the work for you. If you take nothing away from this other than that, let the system do the heavy lifting.
And you know how you find out who changed something on those bridge calls? It's the first person that gets on there and says, "Hey, I need to jump off real quick and go check something out."
Yeah, it's you after the 10 people go, "Well, it wasn't me.
Not
I'm
me,
sorry,
not
it wasn't
me."
me, not me." So,
Okay, great. Yeah, let's move on to the next slide here. All right, so this is where making sure everything is documented is absolutely key. How many people really do a good job of documenting what they're supposed to document? Does anybody document what they're supposed to document? I have not seen it happen ever.
I've never met the person who documents all their stuff thoroughly, and that includes myself. That includes the guy in the mirror. So,
and myself as well. I'll admit to that one. All right, so that's again something that if you can automate the documentation, why not? It just makes perfect sense to make sure any violations are documented. Let's have in this case, in the Jenkins, I'm showing an example of clicking on the link here, and then boom, it pops up. Hey, here's what we found out here. Here's why we failed. Here's how we accepted. Here's all the things the number of table spaces that were added, the number of this or that were done. All documented. You can take that, you can send it to a ticketing system, maybe something like ServiceNow. You can send it to some other table out there. Or that's where I was. Okay. Yes, so you can take that information and send it, and then it's always there. All right, so it's absolutely key to document those violations. And then again, the notification. All right, so notifications, will go out to multiple parties. It's not just the DBA that's included. It's also the application developer. It's the system programmer. Everybody can be notified, and then you make sure everybody's on the same page. It's not like, oh, the system programmer found out about something and he didn't realize that the application developer didn't know about it. You know what? Let's get everybody on the same page. Provide the same type of information across the board. Go ahead and jump to the next slide, Ben. Okay. There we go. Okay. And then this is just an example. I mean, it doesn't have to be an email message. Maybe we can go back to the basics and send pages out, right?
Yeah, but I mean, I've seen these kind of systems. So whether they're data or not, I've seen these kind of systems integrated with Teams, integrated with Slack, integrated with your IM Teams channels or Slack channels that are full of, with your operations and development resources. This can be as instantaneous as you want it. And again, all of this is APIs. All this technology exists. We're not trying to, splice the atom in a new way here. This is all there. It's just a matter of creating the pipelines and the piping to be able to do this. It all exists.
Absolutely. Okay, jump to the next slide then here. All right, so this is another example of more of a detailed view. So when you have that rules engine under the covers there, and you do have something that gets violated, again, we can document that, we can send a notification, but then being able to jump right into the tool, all right, and actually see those violations in more of a visual fashion. Now, people that love the green screen probably like my previous notification of violations, which was just a text thing out there, right? But you know what? Next generation folks kind of like to see graphical things. Management likes to see graphical things. So this is a perfect example of where we can break down the schema standard violations and analyze it by rule. These were the exact rules that were violated, the number of that was violated, to help us troubleshoot and solve these problems.
Picture's worth 1,000 words.
Okay, next slide here. So now when we look at that and we say, all right, we have these violations, we need to resolve those. Some of those violations the DBA needs to resolve. Some of the violations you'll push back to the developer. All right, but the important thing is we're going to take those violations, we're going to resolve those violations, and we're going to say, let's run it again. Now we're going to reach that next step of the process here. And again, this is where we put a gate. Was, you know, do I approve? As a DBA, do I approve that these standards have been met? Now, at this point, I would be very comfortable with automation, right? I don't need this approval process because I've seen everything and I've seen, oh, we had some violations. We've resolved those violations. They've all been resolved. Man, just let it run through. But we do provide that gate so you can maintain control, which is a lot of people are scared of, especially up front.
Yeah, and you see this a lot. And there was a question in the chat that I just saw, which is, don't you do all your testing and your validation before you deploy? And yes, from a unit testing point of view, but to me, when you're talking about data and data changes, those are really post-deployment. Those are validations post-deployment number one. But to your point, you have to remember this is going through multiple tiers. You're going to start out in your development environment, then theoretically go to your test environment, then hopefully go to some QA or pre-prod or whatever. And that's just assuming you have four steps before you go to production. And you're going to want to have different levels of this at each one of those, depending upon when you actually implement your data changes. Hopefully at each level, but I've worked with organizations that really only do this in pre-prod. But again, you're going to have this pipeline is not just going to be a single 4, 5, 6 level pipeline. There are going to be multiple pipelines that keep getting called in a chain sequence that go through. So to answer that question from the chat, yes, but you're also going to want to have this done. You're also going to want to have your testing and specifically your scanning before you get there, and you're going to want to do it at multiple levels. And this is like probably a final check, if I'm getting what you're saying correctly, Ron, before you get into production. So this is just one last, everything is good.
Exactly. Just making sure that I've got the final approval and I let things go then.
Yep.
Okay, so now that we've got the schemas in place, we've got that last thing that we have to handle, and that's the SQL code. We don't want that select star out there. And you know, the tools that are available out here have this type of stuff built in. So the site standard schema changes and things like that, that's really site specific, that's company specific. But SQL, there are best practices out there, and these best practices are built into tools. All right, so very simple, let's just add those tools into the pipeline. Okay, so in this case, we're going to go ahead and analyze the SQL. So if you notice on the Jenkins pipeline, down below was the one, okay, well, we hit a failure. All right, we resolved it. Now we're running, and now we're a little bit further along. We're in the analyzing the code. Go ahead and hit the next slide here. Okay, and just like schema changes, let's say there is something, there's a select star out there, there's something out there that we analyze that SQL and we realize it's going to have a tremendous performance impact. The last thing we want to do is push that out into production. We want to stop that. Again, we want to roll back. And now we have to roll back the entire pipeline because we can't leave the schema changes in there because the SQL is designed for the old schema. So when we roll back on a failure here, we're going to roll back those SQL changes. We're going to roll back all the way to the schema changes. We're going to make sure that we don't leave it in a bad state.
Yeah, and I mean, how many times have you been involved in one where you need to roll back, but the system has then been updating because the rollback wasn't immediate and you have it as a manual process, and now you're stuck and you have no choice but to fix forward. You have no choice but to go forward because you already have data in that column, in that additional table, in whatever, and it makes it 10 times more difficult. By automating these rollbacks and having that in there, now you have immediate feedback before you really start updating your system, and you're not stuck in that fugue state where you can't move. We have to go back, but you can't move forward because of it. So
Yep. And in that state, you end up with a production problem. You got performance out there, and you're like, we'll fix performance later. Not because that's the right thing to do, but it's because you have to do it.
it's your only choice. Yeah.
It's your only choice. Exactly. All right. So I think we just got maybe one or two slides left. So we're just kind of wrapping up here. Just like the schema changes, we want to be able to do a detailed analysis of those violations. What SQL change out there was impacting something, and now we provide that again. We notify, just like we talked about notification before, whether it's to teams, whether it's email, it doesn't really matter. Let's get that out there. People can take a look at it. It may be a DBA things that have to be adjusted. It may be a app dev person, but again, we let everybody know. And then finally, kind of wrapping it up here, you see here, we had a couple, the bottom one was the start here where we went through and we hit schema changes and there were some violations. We resolved those. We moved up, we went through, we hit some SQL changes. Okay, again, we backed out, but then we resolved those SQL changes. And then the final one, at the top one, green across the board, we basically are able to automate everything in a single run, which is the ultimate way that we want to end. Everything automated, all approvals processed sequentially, and we're pushing not just the code into production, we're pushing schema changes and we're pushing the new SQL into production. So there, that wraps it up. That is the ultimate way to start automating your process from start to finish.
Yeah, and first off, I want to really appreciate everyone, who attended. Hopefully you got something out of this. We're definitely looking for thoughts. All of these slides have been uploaded onto the site, so you should be able to download those when GS UK makes them available. And really appreciate Marcus and everybody in the DB2 track who gave us a chance to talk about this. And like I said, automating everything under the sun is a passion of mine. And I think you heard it in Ron's voice. It's a passion of his too. So we're definitely excited as people go down their DevOps journey to have to increase your maturity by starting to fold more and more and more things into your pipeline.
Thanks everybody. I really appreciate your time.
Yep. Thank you.
Good. Thanks, everyone. I really appreciate your time, Ron and Anthony, and thanks everyone for joining. Please don't forget to leave your feedback. It's on the same session that you're logged on as. So thank you very much and good evening, and we shall see you tomorrow.